Hey everyone, there's an ideological battle on the minds of the masses being propagated by a lot of nefarious people that are deeply entrenched into a lot of the bureaucracy and institutions that now dominate and affect almost every area or aspect of our lives. And the best way possible to counter this kind of stuff, this kind of narrative, this kind of division, this kind of rhetoric is to shine a big old spotlight on it, propagate it to the masses, and help them decipher and determine facts from fiction so they can make better and well-informed decisions in regards to social and economic policies or issues. Headline of the National Post: Jordan Peterson, it's ideology versus science in psychology's war on boys and men. The coup of the American Psychological Association undertaken by the ideologues is now complete. So as a psychology professor himself, Jordan Peterson has been warning us for a while now. And I mean, he's in the belly of the beast, right? He functioned in the belly of that beast for a long time. So he's someone that actually knows with firsthand experience and knowledge. Don't allow the media to put forth and present any notion that you shouldn't listen to what Jordan Peterson's got to say because he's some, scary right-winger or misogynist or, all the negative connotations or rhetoric or insults they espouse or anything that challenges the political orthodoxy or the ideology that now seems to dominate the political and media and academic landscape. This is special to the National Post. Jordan Peterson, February 1st, 2019. The American Psychological Association recently released its guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. It manages to be simultaneously predictable, reprehensible, infuriating, and disheartening. No mean feat for a single document. Make no mistake about it, this document constitutes an all-out assault on masculinity, or, to put it even more bluntly, on men. The coup of the APA undertaken by the ideologues is now complete. The field has been compromised, perhaps fatally, and the damnable guidelines provide sufficient, but by no means exhaustive, evidence of that. Why should we care? For that I defer to Robert W. Levinson, when he was president of the Association for Psychological Science, an organization formed in an attempt to retain integrity in the field. We all will come into close contact with mental illness during our lives. The diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of mental illness must reflect the very best science possible. Good intentions are not enough. History is replete with well-intentioned practitioners offering treatments of no proven scientific value that were enthusiastically embraced by patients and their families, but ultimately did absolutely no good and kept people from seeking truly effective treatments. We cannot allow ideology and political correctness to prevail over science. The Boys and Men document is propagandistic to a degree that is almost incomprehensible. The document opens with some definitions of terminology. These serve perfectly to indicate the nature of the ideological substructure that constitutes the true motivation of the writers. Only a few words or phrases were chosen for definition, which means that these words are given prime import. The intent is to give the guidelines readers will understand, assimilate, and come to regard as self-evident the conceptual structure that both selected the words and defined them. And these, by the way, could not possibly be clearer indicators of the postmodern victimhood ideology. Here are the words and phrases: gender, cisgender, gender bias, gender role strain, masculinity ideology, gender role conflict, oppression, privilege, psychological practice, and gender sensitive. These are all presented, along with their interpretations and definitions, available here for your detailed perusal. Here's two, just for the flavor. Oppression. Oppression includes discrimination against and or systematic denial of resources to members of groups who are identified as inferior or less deserving than others. Oppression is most frequently experienced by individuals with marginalized social identities, is manifested in both blatant and subtle discrimination in areas such as racism, ageism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism, and results in limited access to social power. Robinson, 2012. Worrell and Reamer, 2003. Privilege. Privilege refers to unearned sources of social status, power, and institutionalized advantage experienced by individuals by virtue of their culturally valued and dominant social identities, e.g. white, Christian, male, and middle upper class. McIntosh, 2008. There's absolutely no indication in the guidelines that these concepts or their definitions constitute the axioms of a primarily political viewpoint. Instead, they are presented as if they are foundational, scientifically credible, and beyond question. Yet there is no consensus among psychologists, for example, about the definition, let alone the existence of, for example, masculinity ideology. There is also no agreement that gender exists solely in the form of roles that are learned as opposed to innate. Although all reasonable scientists agree that much of human behavior, including that related to sex, is learned. And there is nothing intellectually credible and certainly nothing scientific and therefore worthy of definition in a document purporting to discuss psychology. About American feminist and activist Dr. Peggy McIntosh's polarizing concept of white privilege. All McIntosh did when formulating her famous doctrine of the late 1980s was write a series of questions, rhetorically aimed at herself about everything that she enjoyed growing up in a rich, white family that she arguably did little to earn. There's no way of going about formulating a scientific proposition. There are rules for constructing questionnaires, methods for determining if a new concept is valid, reliable, and unique, and she followed none of them. Had McIntosh submitted her white privilege questionnaire as an honors thesis at a psychology department in a credible research university, she would have received a failing grade. Unfortunately, although entirely predictably, the absolute absence of scientific methodology mattered not at all to the pseudo-academics who granted her musings the status of undeniable fact, including those who wrote the guidelines, and that's an excellent indication of the perniciousness of the document. The document opens with the claim that socialization for conforming to traditional masculinity ideologies has been shown to limit males' psychological development, constrain their behavior, result in gender role strain and gender role conflict, and negatively influence mental health. A claim derived in no small part from the research published by the very people who wrote the guidelines, and one presented, like the definitions, with no indication whatsoever that this claim by no means constitutes anything resembling established scientific fact. Let me translate this opening salvo into something approximating clear and blunt English. The authors are claiming that men who socialize their boys in a traditional manner destroy their mental health. To this needs to be added a second claim, which is distributed more subtly throughout the remainder of the document. We'll begin with this quote. Research suggests that socialization practices that teach boys from an early age to be self-reliant, strong, and to minimize and manage their problems on their own yield adult men who are less willing to seek mental health treatment. In combination with this one, men are overrepresented in prisons and are more likely than women to commit violent crimes and are at greatest risk of being a victim of violent crime, e.g. homicide and aggravated assault, Federal Bureau of Investigations 2015. So it's not only that men who encourage their boys to be self-reliant, strong, and manage their problems on their own destroy the mental health of their children, they also produce adults who are a primary menace to their families and society. That is all bad enough conceptually, rhetorically, and politically, but is also a lie scientifically. To indicate, as the writers have, that is the socialization of boys and men by men that is producing both a decrement in the personal mental health of males and females and a threat to the social fabric is not only to get the facts wrong, but to get them wrong in a manner that's directly antithetical to the truth. I expect we might get into a lot of women that are raising these boys, a lot of single mothers. Hopefully that's brought up and contained within the body of this article. First, there is no scientific evidence that aggression per se is learned. Like fear, pain, hunger, and thirst, rage is instinctual. The biological evidence for this is crystal clear and unshakable. I would guide interest readers to Jack Pensep's masterful effective neuroscience and to Jeffrey Gray's neuropsychology, which are the two best books ever written on the biology of motivation and emotion. Aggression in infants is noticeable and measurable in the early months of life, not least as a consequence of the analysis of facial emotion, a science which is well developed and which sheds substantive light on the putative inner life of as of yet speechless young children. There is substantive individual variation in aggression, but some general truths can be extracted. Boys are more aggressive when young than girls. On average, some young boys are more aggressive than others. Aggression peaks among young children around the age of 2. Most aggressive 2-year-olds have been properly socialized, so that their rage is under control by the age of 4. Here are a couple of peer-reviewed papers published with my colleagues. The first is heavily biological. The second concentrates more on developmental psychology. So the idea that aggression is learned is not only wrong, it's backward. Aggression is easy. Civilized behavior is difficult. It is the integration of aggression that is learned, and it is primarily men who teach it, particularly to aggressive boys. How do we know this? It's simple. And it is this simple fact that is absolutely damning to the claims in the APA document. What kind of families produce violent young men? Fatherless families. There we go. I was hoping we were going to get to that point, and here it is. The pernicious effect of fatherlessness is exceptionally well documented. No serious researcher questions it. Even the generally damnable sociologists admit it. See, for example, here. Fatherless girls tend towards early sexual experimentation, something in itself linked to antisocial behavior, and unsurprisingly, higher rates of teenage pregnancy. What might be more surprising, however, is there is even evidence for early puberty among girls whose fathers are absent. Fatherless boys are overrepresented as alcoholics, addicts, gang members, prisoners, rapists, and murderers. If it is fatherless boys who are violent, how can it be that masculine socialization produces harm both to mental health and society? The data should indicate precisely the opposite, that boys who are only raised by women are much less violent than boys who have men in their lives, and similarly, that boys who do have fathers are more violent than those who do not. That is not the case, period. And not only is it, there's a lot of studies out there to talk about this and point this out, but you know yourself in your own personal life, or all the people that you grew up. You know the ones that didn't have a father in the household, right? You know the discrepancy there. You know the variances. You know the variables, and you know that real world experience definitely resonates with what Jordan Peterson is suggesting in this article. The APA document writers, who are also, by the way, very likely to disproportionately cite their own research, are unexcusably unaware of the basic biological facts, as well as either ignorant or willfully blind to the data pertaining to the absence of fathers and, therefore, to the lack of a guiding masculine hand. The primary axiom of the ideologues who generate this kind of propagandist discourse is that Western culture is to be regarded as an oppressive patriarchy, unfairly male-dominated, violent, racist, sexist, homo, Islamo, and transphobe, and as uniquely reprehensible in all those regards. There is no doubt, to give the devil his due, that human history as such is a blood-drenched nightmare, and that it is also true of Western civilization. However, to view humanity in general, or the West in particular, as solely characterized by its pathology is indication of a profound and fatal failure to discriminate good from bad. How in the world did this happen? To answer this question, we need to delve a bit more deeply into the history of the American Psychological Association itself. The APA is the preeminent professional and scientific organization of psychologists in the U.S., with 54 divisions covering the subspecialties of psychology and a membership of almost 120,000. It runs many of the major journals in which psychological research is published. Furthermore, it is actively involved in the accreditation of the training programs that produce, in particular, clinical psychologists. For decades, APA approval of a university-based clinical psychological program was an indication of entrance into intellectual big leagues, and for good reason. A clinical PhD from a good research school has historically been almost unmatchable in its utility and in the integrity and knowledge of its holders. APA-approved clinical programs were once organized on principles formulated at the 1949 Conference on Graduate Education in Clinical Psychology, held in Boulder, Colorado, and known for the reason as the Boulder Model. Graduates from Boulder Model programs are expected to be scientists, practitioners, to both understand and have contributed to the relevant scientific literature pertaining to psychological issues, as well as to be well trained in scientific validated diagnostic procedures and treatment. For decades, that meant primarily exceptional familiarity with behavioral psychology, a very practical approach to treatment based on an understanding of behavior derived from the careful and eminently scientific work of lab-based psychologists. It was all working very well until cracks started to appear in the profession in the late 1980s, uncoincidentally during the last rise of the political correctness and ideological purity. Simply put, the scientists became wary of the increasingly ill-informed and dogmatic approach that came to characterize the APA, as it became dominant by political types who substitute for their lack of genuine knowledge the idiot ideology of the postmodernists and hard left-leaning activists. The Association for Psychological Science, APS, was formed in an attempt to retain the field's integrity. It produced its own journals, held its own conferences, and attracted some 30,000 members. It also worked on revising the APA's clinical program accreditation process, which was criticized by then APS President Levinson in 2009 in the following manner. The vast majority of clinical psychologists are now trained in programs in which science plays only a minor role. In the epistemology embraced by many of the programs, the primacy of scientific evidence is rejected, and students are trained to use methods of diagnosis, treatment, and prevention that have little to no scientific support. Why should anyone care apart from the evidence that yet another element of the culture closely associated with universities has become corrupt and unreliable? First, let's return to Levinson's prescient words about the prevalence and associated costs of mental illness in society and the necessity of delivering the very best science in the field. Second, the APA plays a determining role in accrediting clinical psychology programs. Because of that, these programs would be pushed in a corrupt direction, in direction proportional to the blindness of the accreditors. Now that the APA have established these guidelines, any practicing professional psychologist or researcher who disagrees with them or challenges them will be laid open to allegations of ethical misconduct. Third, the net effect of these guidelines will be to radically decrease the probability that any man or boy with any sense will go anywhere near the APA-approved psychologist or dare, as an ambitious and interested undergraduate, to enroll in an APA-approved clinical psychology program, which are already, by the way, overwhelmingly dominated at the graduate school level by women. Fourth, the APA is promulgating under the guise of science absolute mistruths about the nature of aggression, violence, and socialization, and this will culminate in the miseducation of individuals and the warping of social policy. And finally, it should be noted that there is almost nothing in the document on how to treat people. I don't believe that a newly practicing and interested young psychologist could derive a single technique from the guidelines worthy of using in a clinical setting. They are not guidelines for psychological practice. They are guidelines for how psychologists must think and what they must believe, or else. There is simply no excuse for what the APA has done. If the people who ran the prestigious and once rigorous clinical programs across North America were thinking clearly, acting courageously, and looking forthright into the future, they would take warning from the content of the new guidelines, denounce them loudly, and announce their intent to refuse all guidance, supervision, and most importantly, accreditation by and from the American Psychological Association. The document produced by the APA purporting to provide guidelines for the psychological treatment of boys and men is disingenuous, scientifically fraudulent, and ethically reprehensible. I believe that the people who wrote it are ill-informed, ideologically possessed, morally weak, and malevolent in their unacknowledged and overweening resentment. I am embarrassed and ashamed to have them speak on behalf of my profession, and would like to apologize to the public for not having been sufficiently awake and outraged earlier to have done more to stop something like this from happening. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, and the author of the multi-million copy bestseller 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. His blog and podcast can be found at jordanpeterson.com. So anyways, yeah, like I said, folks, excellent article. And you know, Jordan Peterson, he's out there doing his thing, folks. He's trying to help to educate and inform us in regard, because like I say, this is a man that's from within the belly of the beast. And even though I see a lot of people out there to try to insinuate or insult him and say, oh, he's an insider or a globalist shill. No, this is someone, just listen to the things he says, look at what he represents, how he's presenting his information, and how rather than using division or identity politics, he uses a genuine understanding of the human experience or human psychology to help us break through a lot of information that's been jammed into our minds by a lot of people with a lot of nefarious purposes and reason behind why they did so, right? So I'm glad to hear that Jordan Peterson put this out, because yes, very few people are in a position to criticize an institution as dominant as the APA with the credibility to do so. But Jordan Peterson is one of those few people, and I'm very much appreciative of the fact that we have someone like Jordan Peterson standing up there in defense of not just individual rights and freedoms and liberty, but helping to break through some of this identity politics or this politically correct culture that is now dominating the media, academia, and the political and ruling class. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.